So I have to start by saying that I never thought that I was gonna would be in academia. And there's this great meme that basically the caption reads, "How did you get into academia?" And then you see a person walking down the street, and then you see a garage door going like, "Deet, deet," and then suddenly the person doesn't really realize that the garage door is closing, and then it goes like, "Deet, deet, deet, deet," and it just like closes down and just shoves the person inside of the garage of academia. But in all seriousness, I really never thought I was going to be in academia. When I was little, I thought I was going to be a journalist. So my dad was a journalist, critical of the government during Guatemala's 36 years war, which had 200,000 people murdered, disappeared, a nation afterwards dealing with genocide, and the person responsible for the genocide free. And I was born a couple of years before the war ended. And I grew up in a town that at the time, when I was a teenager, I thought was extremely boring and really far away from everything that I thought as a teenager was fun. So I spent basically hours and hours in my dad's cigarette-smelling office, watching TV, not knowing what to do. Eventually, I started going through the magazine's archives. And I started asking my dad a lot of questions about these archives, about these magazines. So he started taking me to some interviews, to some meetings, and I started meeting a really, really interesting bunch of people. I began writing some very dramatic reviews, very dramatic poems as a teenager about things I saw at school, books I read, questions that I had and were just like lingering in my mind all the time. So I had decided I was going to be a journalist, and like many of my favorite female superheroes in Central America, I was also going to be a poet. And I tried it for a couple of years. I started a school newspaper. I had really long, deep teenage chats with some really good friends who are now actually really good writers. I got really engaged with social media, then university, jobs here and there, spoken word a bit. And years later, many, many years later, I was writing a piece on feminicides with a now really good friend of mine. I was editing the magazine of my university, and I was writing this piece with a really good friend of mine, Mariano. He knew I was looking for extra gigs and I needed money, so he was like, there's this opening at the research center I'm working at. You should apply. And this is the moment in which, that garage door that goes like, just shoved me inside of academia. And it was a really big surprise, but it was a really good surprise. I discovered that it was basically everything that I loved: reading, interviewing, constructing and deconstructing ideas, finding the words to explain really complex things, failing and starting all over again. It was somehow a tweaked form of long, really slow journalism. So within academia, I went together with a really great bunch of colleagues from mapping hundreds and hundreds of cases of citizen engagement and ways in which citizens got it within decision-making in Central America and the Caribbean, to focusing on really specific cases of people deliberating environmental futures. I went back to the topics that were not really addressed during Guatemala's peace accords: the democratic governance of extractivism and land distribution. These topics today, these historical struggles, mean today new proxy conflicts, forced displacement, extrajudicial killings of environmental and indigenous leaders, entire villages burned to the ground today, just like during the war, for green mining, for monoculture, for hydropower. I could go on and on. So basically, I started studying different forms of prior consultation. How are communities defending the land against extractive capitalism and nationalist agendas in parallel to elections and in parallel to protests? What are other forms in which they are resisting to all of this? Demanding the right to be consulted, to set these deliberative processes within their territories, and to be in fact able to approve or reject an extractive project. And while I was researching these processes, I often stumbled with the same challenge. Local processes were dependent on not only the agendas of national governments, but also the agendas of private companies, private corporations, international organizations, and the agendas of philanthropies. So when I learned about the Global Assembly, I was really excited. I thought that this assembly could somehow respond to the challenges that these local and national and transnational levels were facing. The Global Assembly was basically a process that gathered 100 citizens from all over the world, people like you, people like your neighbors, people who perhaps like your grandmothers, or people who live really, really far away from you. And the assembly would be held basically in connection to COP, the United Nations Climate Change Conference. This was the place where the Paris Agreement was adopted, and the deliberation of citizens, of these 100 citizens, would not only reach, the typical actors like NGOs or civil society organizations or national governments, but it was going to be able to reach international lobbyists and governments that have historically until today benefited from extracting the land and erasing the autonomous governance structures of peoples around the world. So there was no binding agreement for this Global Assembly, but still I was hopeful and I was excited. And I became part of the evaluation team led by Professor Nicole Curato. And we started by basically co-designing a survey led by Hannah Werner. And the results that we were getting from these surveys that we gave to participants throughout the assembly were overwhelmingly positive. So I was, getting even more excited. So the majority of citizens in the survey said that they found the assembly to be extremely valuable. They thought that the facilitators enabling the deliberation within the assembly were neutral. They thought that they were really trying to give the word to all participants, and nobody was really extremely left behind. Most believed that the output of the Global Assembly, which was the People's Declaration, largely reflected the content that they were deliberating on. But then, on the last survey that we gave them, there was a question. Do you think that other participants have different ideas, different from yours? And they largely agreed on the fact that just a few participants, or actually none of them, had ideas that are too different from their own ideas. And things started getting tricky from there. So we basically then started interviewing the facilitators, we started interviewing participants, and we started actually watching the recordings of these deliberations. And I started coding them. So I would sit in my kitchen table, put on my earphones, I would press play on the recordings. Perhaps the facilitator would open a session and they would be like, talk to me about, your children or your neighbors or your environment. Talk to me, they would break the ice. And then they perhaps would play a recording by an expert that was saying, who was talking about perhaps, nationally determined contributions and what that actually means. And perhaps another recording of a person who works in a mine and explains why that person has to work in a mine. And then the facilitator would ask a question, and a participant who's perhaps remember these are 100 people from all over the world. So perhaps a participant would reply in Spanish, and then a translator would come, and then he would say it to English. Then another translator would translate it to Hindi to the participant who perhaps spoke Hindi, and then that participants would reply to the question, and then they would give the word to somebody who perhaps spoke Swahili. So I spent hours and hours sitting in my kitchen or in my office trying to make sense of this process. And I started noticing how people grew fond of each other. They really started missing each other, started joking around, starting to really get to know each other within this space. But somehow one thing remained constant, and all data was pointing to it. Survey data, the data that I was coding from the video recordings, interviews, everything. There was almost no conflict. People would hardly disagree between each other. And I was really shocked, because the last process that I had been investigating was the prior consultation processes over the Oshek hydroelectric dam in Santa Maria Cabón in Guatemala. And let me tell you, there was lots of conflicts. There were consultations done by the government. There were consultations done by indigenous communities. There were unlawful detentions. There was the criminalization of indigenous leaders. There was the criminalization of activists. There were protests. Bernardo Cabal spent years as a person of our conscience in jail. There was the fear of community members colluding with the company. There were voices on a possible marriage happening so that the company would have access to a piece of land that was key for the hydroelectric company. There were tensions between the priest and the bishops. There were parallel community leaders. There were complaints about NGOs. There were several jokes about researchers doing academic research on these processes. And there were young voices really struggling to decide between the promises of extractive capitalism in one of the poorest regions in Central America and the historical demands for land ownership and deliberative autonomy. So for me, deliberating on the climate crisis was messy. But the climate assembly, the global climate assembly that I was seeing on my computer was not really messy. So I didn't know what to do. I was confused. The data was consistent, and I was really trying to make sense of it. I eventually started tying it to what a facilitator described in an interview as a pre-designed, structured process that made you feel straitjacketed, to focusing on educating and forming the communities of a highly unequal world rather than focusing on the governance, to a deeper problem that I should have seen coming in this transnational setting, that is bringing people whose oppression built the climate crisis to deliberate on top of the same foundations that created this ecological crisis. So I wonder if the future of climate governance and of collaborative governance will be deliberative, whether it will be participatory. But I also wonder if it will finally give land and deliberative autonomy back to indigenous peoples. I wonder whether the Eurocentrism of academia is actually letting us look into the right direction when we talk about democratic responses to the climate crisis. And I wonder whether the governance of the transition will make space for the difficult questions and all of the voices that are going to be affected by the crisis upon us.